It's Wednesday, it's 11:15. We're live in Westminster for Prime Minister's Questions. Theresa May will face Jeremy Corbyn in 45 minutes, with little sign that she can persuade him or anything close to a majority of MPs to back her Brexit deal.
The Prime Minister's deal has many critics. What we haven't heard, though, is a better plan. This is the only plan available.
It's not exactly upbeat, but the Chancellor says it's the least damaging course for the economy. His critics disagree.
The Treasury's forecasts in the past have almost never been right and have, more often, been dramatically wrong.
Later, Mrs May continues her tour of the UK as she tries to reach beyond Parliament to sell her plan to the public. The Prime Minister is campaigning for her deal as if it was a general election. Theresa May taking her case and her campaign skills to the country. What could possibly go wrong? And we're joined today by former Cabinet Minister Priti Patel, Labour MP Stephen Kinnock, The Guardian's Deputy Political Editor Pippa Creer, and Editor of City AM Christian May. Welcome to you all. Now, first today, let's have a look at the front page of today's Mail. It's a rather different Daily Mail these days from the one it was only a couple of months ago. This one claims that new polling shows that voters want MPs to back Theresa May's Brexit deal. And you see that figure down there. Should MPs back Theresa May's Brexit deal? 41% yes, 31% no. Still within the margin of error, but it's a 3-point lead. Stephen Kinnock, will MPs listen to public opinion on this?
It really doesn't look like it, Andrew. I think we've got 80 or 90 at least Tory MPs who said publicly they won't back it. We are clear on the Labour side. Yeah, well, we know that there will be now some severe pressure being applied by the whips. I think that number may well drop, but whichever way you slice it, it doesn't look like this deal is going to go through. We've been clear we want a general election. If that doesn't happen, all options must be on the table. My personal view is that there is a clear plan B out there, which is Norway Plus. It gets us out of the European Union, protects jobs, and delivers on the result of the referendum.
Priti, are you going to ignore your voters as well then?
I'm not ignoring my voters. I've actually spoken to my constituents. I speak to businesses locally Monday evening. I spent time with businesses not just from my constituency but from the county of Essex and from the region of East Anglia. And there are a range of views out there, and I have to say they're not at all supportive of the Prime Minister's deal.
But what about this poll, though?
Well,
yeah.
I can't speak for a poll because I don't know who their sample was, where it was taken around the country.
No, by Survation, political parties use
I'm not saying
groups
that
like Survation.
I'm not dismissing that at all. You know, you've asked me, will I listen to the people? I listen to the people from my constituency, my part of the country, which, by the way, Andrew, was a vote Leave constituency. And Essex.
No, I understand, but I think a lot of people who voted Leave must also be saying, let's back Mrs May's deal. I mean, I guess the government would say that Mrs May's campaign is working. Look, because I was looking at the difference. If you look at the actual figures, Pippa, because that one there I quoted is should MPs back it, but if you ask are people in favour of the deal or not, for 37 against 35. So again, it's not much. But the for's up 10 and the against are down 14.
Yeah, and the indications are that, certainly according to this poll, that the public may not be massively enamoured by May's deal, but they would rather that the government just got on with that. And that very much chimes with the narrative that the Prime Minister is trying to set out as she goes around the country, that really the public just want, irrespective of what the debate is here at Westminster over the detail, she believes that she's delivered on what she promised and that the public just want her government to get on with it. Whether that message is enough to convince her MPs, I hear my doots, but we'll see.
And I have my doubts as well. I like it. You look at one of the questions there on the front. It's not ideal, but is it best on offer? That's a kind of loaded question in a way, isn't it? That's a question designed to get a particular answer. And of course it does. It gets 52% yes.
So not ideal.
And 19 no. But it must give... I mean, these are bleak times for Mrs May. This poll poll will give us some encouragement.
I think Number 10 are going to cling to whatever scrap of a blanket they can at the moment. It's pretty cold out there for them. Some of the people in Number 10, basically the only reason they get out of bed in the morning at the moment is because, and you basically heard Philip Hammond say it, that whilst they don't see a majority for their own position, they take comfort from the fact that there's no majority for anyone else's position either, which is not necessarily the most coherent legislative strategy, but it is something they're clinging on to. I think, from the perspective of the square mile and in the city, we're asking whether MP should listen to opinion polls. I think the city has given up listening to MPs, and there was a sense from pretty early on that the government thought the city was big enough to look after itself in this debate, and it's basically what's happened. If Whitehall and other parts of the economy were anywhere near as well prepared for no deal plus any other scenario as financial and professional services, then I think we'd be in for a smoother few months than we are, because I think the city is actually incredibly well prepared for whatever outcome may emerge.
That's interesting, because financial services and the professional services associated with them are about 14% of our GDP. And you're saying that they've kind of done what they can to cope with any eventuality.
So below the radar, the Bank of England, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Prudential Regulatory Authority have been working for a year now to put in place the temporary permissions regime and basically say to EU-registered entities who either have a huge base in the city or who dip in to get a little bit of capital from time to time, even in the event of an acrimonious no deal, we will give you the permission to stay status quo for 3 years unchanged. And over 1,500 EU firms have put their name on that list to say, we do want to stay. So the frustration is that EU regulators have not been prepared to be as fulsome in the way they would welcome UK firms to continue their business. But the city and the city's regulators have been way out ahead on this.
Let's look at another headline in this morning's papers. Brexit making headlines almost every day these days. This is from The Sun, a typical Sun headline, Massacre. The play on May and Massacre. And it says here, Pippa, though, that the Prime Minister heads for a 200-vote disaster. Now, the consensus here in Westminster is that she's likely to lose the vote on the 11th. I've not seen it put that high. What are your sources? What's your sense?
Well, I think, it is high, but it is definitely looking, contrary to what Number 10 might like, as though the rebellion is growing rather than receding as days go by. Obviously, we've still got about 10 days for that to change. And I think part of that is because MPs feel that they've almost been given carte blanche to vote whichever way they like, because so much has been made of the fact that no deal is not an option. Amber Rudd and others have said in the Commons that the one thing there is a majority for in the Commons is that no deal can't happen. There'll be
we can't leave on no deal.
Exactly, and there will be some way found of preventing that happening. Not quite sure yet what that would be, but that because of that, MPs kind of feel that they've got the freedom to actually do what they want this time. And because the consensus is, as you rightly say, in Westminster, that everybody expects the deal to fall first time, and then who knows what happens next. But it's kind of given MPs the freedom to do that and not really to be too concerned about it. The numbers that I'm hearing, one number which is particularly interesting, being talked about in government circles and at Number 10, is 100. And it's been suggested that that might be the number that if Theresa May's, if the rebellion or if she loses the vote by more than that, then she's toast. But if she manages to keep it within that limit, even though she would lose the vote, that she could somehow plod on. Now, that sounds very much like expectation management to me.
Yes. Stephen, even if she doesn't lose by as bad as the Sun suggests, or Pippa's figures there, if she loses this vote by 30, 40, 50 votes, is on the wrong end of 50, she can't go back to Brussels and say, just give me a few tweaks and I'll get it over the line. If she loses by 10 or 5 or maybe even 15, that's a possible strategy. Back to Brussels, as happened with the Irish when they voted against a treaty. Certain things were clarified, things were more closely defined. If she loses by anything like this amount, I suggest she can't do it.
No, I think it would require a fundamental change in the political declaration to commit us to EFTA EEA. If she pivots to that Norway plus position, I think she can do that very rapidly. She will get the sign-off from Brussels very rapidly, and then I think we have a deal. I think that there is a parliamentary majority for Norway Plus, and I think that is actually now the only plan B that is on offer. So I think there is a way through this. Clearly,
because you've been a big supporter of you were a supporter of Remain. But in the absence of that, your fallback position has been Norway.
I've been banging on about this for 2 years now. I've sort of been droning on like a scratched record about Norway, Norway Plus. I've always felt that the 52-48 Leave vote was the British people saying we want to move house, but we want to stay in the same neighbourhood. We don't want to go to another city or to another planet, which is what certain people in Pritty's party would like us to do.
Well, let's hear Pritty.
That, I think, delivers on the democratic mandate. It also protects jobs. It takes us out of the European Court of Justice, and there is the potential for controls on free movement of labour and safeguards. It is a compromise, and my God, we need a compromise.
You will know that the court.
It's a strong compromise.
You will know that the court that is justiciable in Norway follows ECJ ruling. So it's only
there are many examples of the EFTA court diverging from the ECJ.
I agree. Listen,
really.
I agree with Stephen on something, which is the political declaration itself is something that has to alter fundamentally, because currently, as it stands, it's not legally binding, it's not enforceable, it's just warm words, it's hope and aspiration. It's
but it still won't be legally binding if you change it.
But that's the premise of changing it and going back and changing it and making it much more structured. And you won't be surprised, Andrew, to hear, where I come from on this. To get the change, I think we have to go back and look at, a Canada-style free trade agreement. It won't happen overnight, but we as a government, I think the entire government, the country now needs to be ready for, transition, getting prepared and ready for moving in that direction. That's something we've not heard from the government at all.
You could take, if that was the way you wanted to go, you could take the current political declaration, which is largely warm words and aspirations and is not legally binding. And you could, in the transition period, if that's what you wanted, go for a Canada free trade arrangement.
That's right. I think
so you don't need to change the declaration.
Well, the government should, but the problem is the political declaration is it's not worth the paper it's written on. Let's be clear about that. It's a nice statement of intent, and that's not going to drive and deliver outcomes. We've got to remove the core, the anchor, the spine through the withdrawal agreement is, of course, the backstop, the implications for Northern Ireland, the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, and, of course, none of this is being addressed by the government
Is there a majority?
It's kind of like take it or leave it.
Stephen is saying that the fallback position may well be, and there could be a majority in Parliament for this, is the Norwegian or a version of Norway. What do you say to that?
I hear this a lot, and, all credit to people that are advocating it. They believe in it, and that's fine. We've heard the Prime Minister say no to it. We've heard others rule it out as well. So let's be clear about that, unless they're going to do a massive U-turn. But I think at the end of the day, there is something still that has to be achieved, which is ensuring that this government delivers the referendum mandate. And that means leaving the single market customs union. And I appreciate this is politically uncomfortable for people that campaign to remain, but also the ECJ, bringing back our freedoms and having our government demonstrate that they are going to be in control of our money, laws and border. Under the current arrangement, that is simply not the case.
The political issue with the Norwegian solution or the Norwegian angle is that it involves the continuation of free movement. That's the hard sell for Remainers and for Leavers.
So Articles 112 and 113 of the EEA agreement enable any EEA state to pull an emergency brake and reconfigure any one of the 4 freedoms that underpin the single market. Now, whether or not you take the decision to do that, it's a big decision because also there's a risk of retaliatory measures from the EU side. But it's there in the treaty. Pritty is right. I agree with her that the political declaration is a truckload of fudge. And the reason is because it doesn't commit us to a model. It's either Canada or Norway. That has always been the case, to give it real meaning. And it might not be legally binding, but we need to make it politically binding. It would be a constitutional outrage if we had a specific commitment in the political declaration, which was then undone by the government after the 29th of March. So we need to make it specific. And we need it to be something that will command a parliamentary majority to get us out of this constitutional crisis, to solve Northern Ireland and to give us the certainty and stability that the country is crying out for.
Is Norway an idea whose time has come in Parliament?
Well, it's got some very loud proponents on the backbenches. Nick Boles is obviously one of the biggest.
Who's a Conservative.
Former minister, who's a Conservative one. And it is true that several cabinet ministers have talked about it as an option, but it's been one option of many that they're looking at. And I think ultimately, when it comes down to it, the emergency brake that Stephen mentions is untested. So it'd be very difficult to conceive of that as properly delivering on Theresa May's red line on immigration, on free movement. And I think politically, whatever the actual realities of the technicalities of it, I think politically that's a massive, massive step for her to overcome.
I mean, they have to let us in. I mean, the British proceeded in this assumption that the EEA or EFTA are all gagging for us to join. We, given our size, given that it's an organisation of Norway's the biggest country in it, we 4 million people, less than five, 3 of them 5. We're assuming they'll welcome us. I tell you this: the first thing, if I was Norway, I'd say, if we let you in, you're not going to trigger that emergency brake, are you? That's a condition of joining.
Look,
Correct.
The Icelandic foreign minister was on Newsnight last night saying absolutely clearly we would be warmly welcomed. The Norwegian Prime Minister has said the biggest trading partner for Norway after the EU is the UK. They want the softest possible Brexit. This is the softest possible Brexit. It's in Norway's interests, the EU's interests, and the UK's interests.
The
I absolutely
Icelandic foreign
agree.
minister said that it was his personal view. He wasn't speaking for his government.
Okay, it's his personal view. But the...
And that would be a condition.
agree.
I wouldn't let you join if you then go and trigger something which is a bit of an atom bomb.
But the other point is...
In my happy little organisation, which gets on well without you
chaos.
Brits coming in and screwing it up.
No, because it's also an opportunity for them to give EFTA real heft. Suddenly, it would become a serious outer ring of countries of the EU. The EU is changing. It's a dynamic organisation, not static. President Macron has said we need a new multi-tier Europe. The UK could be the leading voice in a new outer tier with a strong economic relationship with the EU, but not part of the political institutions. It's what we've been crying out for this reform for decades.
The elephant in the room with this, and you're getting ahead of yourselves, if I may say, as MPs, is that you are not going to pick a new Brexit path, and let alone a new settlement, by a show of hands in Parliament. This requires a new government, at least a new Prime Minister. The current Prime Minister has ruled these options out. So by law, by the laws that are in place, the UK is leaving the EU on the 29th of March next year, regardless of what arrangements are put in place up to by that point. So you can't simply say that we'll sit on our hands during the debate on this deal and assume that we'll take a wildly different path come February or early March.
But we've just agreed that no deal is not an option. It is also the Prime Minister's duty.
But it is an option, isn't it? In the absence of...
Well, we've just agreed that there's no parliamentary majority for it, so it's not going to happen if Parliament doesn't allow it to happen.
Well, they might not be able to
As
stop
Amber Rudd
it.
has said.
They
How
might.
do they stop it?
Become a reality.
Have a sit-in?
It's
I mean,
going-
they pass a motion, as I understand it, Stephen. And if there was a motion saying we should not leave on no deal, I think we're all agreed there would be a big majority
Yes.
in Parliament for that, not leaving a no deal.
Yes.
So the Commons has had its say. And the government says, OK, fair enough. What would happen?
There are also other options available, and I mentioned the soft Brexit option being discussed by Plan B being discussed by various cabinet ministers. Staying in the customs union is also one that, if May were to pivot, and I'm not convinced that she will pivot to anything, to be honest, I think she'll just try and push through her deal a second time. But if she were to pivot, then that's something which could win the support of Labour, which of course wants a customs union. And actually, from Labour's perspective, it's almost like the ultimate conclusion of the policy of constructive ambiguity, because they can say to their Brexit supporting voters that they are helping to deliver Brexit, and they can say to their Remain supporting members that they're helping to guarantee frictionless trade by backing the customs union and getting a better deal than the Prime Minister has offered. So, I mean, that's an option. I mean, none of us really know. But
whether it can be delivered by the current Prime Minister is another issue, because if she was to go down that route, cue this programme and many others, bringing up endless clips of her saying, we are leaving the customs union.
Absolutely.
We will do our own trade deals. We are leaving the customs union. It would be... I could see a different Prime Minister maybe going down that route.
Yes, but these also are incredible times, aren't they? And unprecedented. And, of course, in any other time, you can imagine a Prime Minister getting she will get a huge amount of flack, whatever happens. But, I think one thing she's shown is that she's pretty doughty, isn't she? And she sort of ploughs on.
She certainly does.
So maybe she'll,
But the problem is also customs union without single market doesn't deliver frictionless trade and does not solve the Irish border
Doesn't solve the
issue.
Northern Ireland issue.
Exactly. You've got to have customs union plus a strong relationship, which for me means full participation in the single market. Otherwise, Northern Ireland doesn't get solved.
Well, I think the problem is for the government currently right now, they've ruled out all other options.
Yes.
And that is why they're trapped in this hamster wheel, literally day in, day out, given this script that seems to be going nowhere.
That's true.
If she loses by a big amount, it's just not a small defeat. It's a clear, major defeat. Doesn't have to be as big as the Sun saying this morning, but it's a big defeat, 50, 60, 70 votes. What happens to her?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's for, I guess, members of Parliament and the Conservative Party to look at and decide. I think the reality is, I think there's a whole lot of expectation management on numbers, by the way. I think it's just important to get that out there. They're talking it high and it'll probably be lower than that. I would really like to see a change in policy. I think that is the purpose. I see many of my colleagues on the Brexit side trying to put down the drawbridge, trying to actually have a more inclusive discussion on the withdrawal agreement, on the backstop, on the customs union, everything to do with the protocol itself.
Right.
And there's been
But
no
this is
engagement.
the keystone of the government's programme. It's almost the purpose of this government.
Has been from day one.
It's always been the case. If governments lose this, either the government goes or the Prime Minister goes, or both.
Well, we're in unprecedented times, I think. And using the term a political crisis is not an understatement to describe where we are at. But it doesn't mean that we should just go with the flow and accept what's being put on the table because we're being told there are no alternatives. And any responsible government has to, as we've been discussing already, listen to different views and work to drive a different outcome.
And have a plan B.
If you wanted a fresh start, if you wanted to try and unravel this agreement and go in a different direction, put it aside whether the Europeans would agree, put aside whether there would be time to do that. I would suggest, unless I'm missing something, that you would need a new leader to do that. You would need a fresh start.
Collectively, I think the party should consider, what happens at the time, and then we'd have to look at the stages and the steps going forward.
Under a new leader?
Well, it could be. I don't know. I simply don't know. No one individual can determine that or decide that. That is for colleagues.
Sounds to me like a new leader, Stephen. What would you say?
Well, look, we've been clear that we want to see a general election. I think it's very difficult to imagine a motion no confidence passing because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. But I think that the Prime Minister, as a public servant, has a duty to have a plan B in place. And that plan B needs to be ready to go on the 11th of December when she loses this vote. And it is up to the Cabinet, very responsible senior people in the Cabinet, as public servants, to intervene with her now and to say, look, you're going to lose this vote. You must have a plan B. The markets are going to go crazy on the 11th of December if we vote.
Not sure they will,
this
actually.
deal down.
Christian?
Okay, maybe not.
I don't think they would.
It's going to be massive uncertainty.
I think they would if the second
you need
vote
to come out
failed
and make
to pass.
it clear.
I think the
Haven't they?
and equities.
If the papers and traders read the Sun, if the papers are seeing that it's pretty certain she's going to lose, which is what is the mood here, the markets will have priced that in. The great surprise with TARP, with that vote in America when Congress the House originally voted down the president's rescue package, was that none of us saw that coming. It was like a bolt out of the blue.
Yeah, I think it is priced in for the first vote. I do think you'd see sterling and equities get a bit slippy off if you lose the second vote. But the big thing, as I said earlier, about the sort of technical and, as far as they can, legal things that the city has put in place to protect its contracts and its business and its trade in certain areas post-Brexit, whatever the outcome. The one thing they don't have control over is what happens if there's just a general economic slump thereafter. And that is perhaps hanging over them as a bigger cloud than the technicalities of what they're able to do under certain terms negotiated. So it's the economic uncertainty that they would probably fear more than the technical uncertainty.
We'll be coming back to Brexit. I wouldn't want to disappoint you, and I know that'll probably come as a surprise to you. But let's move on and talk about events off the coast of Crimea at the weekend, when Russian ships, a navy, fired, well, actually it was the FSB, is their intelligence service boats, they fired on and seized 3 Ukrainian naval boats. In a moment, we're going to be joined by the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Natalia Galibarenko. But first, let's hear what the US has had to say overnight. This is a spokesperson from the US State Department.
You may ask, what can European governments do? Many governments have imposed sanctions on Russia for its actions in Crimea, in Ukraine. Not all of those sanctions, as I have been told and our experts have explained to me, have been fully enforced. So that is one thing that we can look for European countries to do more when we talk about doing more.
So that's the US State Department in Washington, D.C., from their Foggy Bottom headquarters there. We're joined by the ambassador for the Ukraine here in the United Kingdom. Ambassador, welcome to our programme. The State Department there was kind of implying that the European allies are not fully imposing the sanctions against Russia they're meant to. Do you agree with that?
No, we are now on the stage when we are, of course, encouraging our European partners to take certain steps and not to, again, to publish statements that they are concerned or that they're deeply concerned or something of that kind. So now we have some quite positive feedback from the Commission Ukraine NATO in Brussels, also from the UN Security Council. So our next step is also to look at the G20 summit, which will be opened tomorrow in Argentina. And I think it would be very good if the European leaders, the UK leader also, I know it's difficult for Theresa May to speak to Mr. Putin, but still to encourage also him to stick to the international law in the Sea of Azov.
Now, the Sea of Azov has two important Ukrainian ports, and you do a lot of trade through this. The only way out is through the Straits of Kerch, and they're controlled by the Russians. They recently opened a new bridge, I think, across from Crimea into another part of Russia. What do you read as the Russian aims here? What do you think they're out to achieve?
Unfortunately, for me, it's quite obvious that after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, it's already 4 years ago, Russians started gradually to block our ships, and not only Ukrainian ships, but all international ships, from going into the Sea of Azov to the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk. So they were using technical things like, for example, putting a big ship under the Kerch bridge,
under the bridge,
and just blocking the strait and creating a very big queue of ships. Or another tactics was to detain ships like for additional technical inspections or checks. And if you can imagine, if we are speaking, for example, about the ship which was carrying food, so another 3 or 4 hours of staying, it can be a disaster for all the business ties. So they were using like this technical step.
But what was their aim? What are they trying? Are they trying to provoke you? I mean, the Ukrainian Navy, I think you lost most of your Navy in Sevastopol.
Yeah, exactly.
When Crimea was taken over by the Russians. So you can't afford a sea clash. But are they trying to provoke you into a clash?
I think they were trying also to show like who is the big guy in the house. So for us not to have any possibility in the future, like not to ask them beforehand in advance that we would like to pass through the Kerch Strait. Another thing is also to endanger the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk, because
these are the 2 ports on Ukrainian territory.
Yes, exactly, and they already, witnessed the decline in their trade flow. So the ships now are trying to do everything in order to omit Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov. So I think that was the main message of the Russian authorities, like who is the guy in the house, who is the boss, exactly.
I've seen reports that the build-up of Russian tanks on the Ukrainian border has grown substantially in recent days. Can you confirm that? And how worried would you be by that?
It was also the statement of the President Poroshenko yesterday about the increase of the quantity of Russian tanks. And of course, I do believe that our intelligence services and the information. And this one is also like another front. So we also witnessed this in the past. So Russians are trying, to give us a blow at different fronts. So infringing us in the Sea of Azov, immediately doing something provocative in Donbass. So I can expect something in the coming days about the economic cooperation. So at one point last year, they stalled all the transits through their territory, and we were blocked from transporting our goods to Kazakhstan and Central Asia.
Which had to go through Russian territory.
Absolutely. So, unfortunately, Russians are very sophisticated in creating something new all the time. And unfortunately for us, we are not so, rapid sometimes to provide a clear response to that.
What should the West's response be? Do we stand by Ukraine?
Well, I lived and worked in Russia for 3 years in St. Petersburg, and the ambassador is absolutely right. They're utterly ruthless. When they decide to come after you, they don't stop. I mean, I think what's happened here is that Putin has taken a hit because of his association with some very unpopular pension reforms and also the complete fiasco of the Skripal crisis. And when he takes a hit domestically, he looks for a distraction in his foreign policy. And this is a classic example of doing that. So I think we actually have to approach Mr. Putin as somebody that is weak, not who is strong.
And what would that mean in policy terms?
Well, for one thing, we need to implement the Magnitsky sanctions. This government, finally, under a huge amount of pressure, passed the Magnitsky amendment to the
which hits Russian individuals.
Which hits Russian individuals. We need to identify the ones who are responsible for building the Kerch Bridge. We need to identify all those that are responsible for organising these actions against the Ukrainian ships in the Sea of Azov. And we need to go after those people personally with asset freezes and visa bans. And we need a full implementation of the Magnitsky Act. We should also be pushing for a European-wide implementation.
Which is coming in.
Yeah.
The Germans have yesterday said that they will back that, and the French are keen. So that's quite a... Bill Browder, who was obviously... Sergei Magnitsky was Bill Browder's lawyer when he was killed in Russia. The Europeans have said they're going to back this.
These are the Germans who are building a new gas line.
With their gas
Russia.
relationship, they can look both ways.
You were nodding there when Stephen
completely,
Kinnock.
absolutely.
But why would Mr. Putin care? So a couple of rich oligarchs have their wealth impounded in London, sometimes through these new unexplained wealth orders and all the rest of it. And that's tough for them. And Mr. Putin says, oh, that's tough for them.
Well, it's not, I don't think, Andrew, it's not a couple of individuals. I think, when you look at money flows and some of the reports that have been written, in fact, I'm on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and we had our own investigation and inquiry into this. It's pretty obvious that there are so many links, individuals, personnels, all link back to Putin. And it is absolutely right that the focus should be targeting individuals on a mass scale at every level in terms of even restricting their movements, what they can do,
I understand
some of their
that.
freedoms.
But we have due process in this country. That is part of being a democracy. You can't just move overnight. You could argue we should have moved long before, but you can't just move overnight to grab somebody's wealth or to stop their movement.
There are ways in
Meanwhile,
which
there's a developing situation on the Straits of Kerch.
Which is why we should also do something else, which is G20 is coming up. Leverage our voice and status as a member of the G20 to work with our allies bilaterally, but to come together to absolutely ensure that there's one voice that's targeted in the right way. What has happened?
Sort of one strong EU voice.
Well, it has to, across the G20, to pull together now, and it's not just the EU.
It would be useful if the EU spoke with one, but of course Britain has no cash, no money in the bank in that one anymore, does it?
Well, yeah, we're apparently giving 39 billion to the EU.
It marshalled an EU response after the Skripal poisoning.
Yes, and actually quite successfully too.
And it's very difficult for me to act, or for Britain to act unilaterally at the moment, precisely because of that. And my understanding is that there's not going to be any bilats between Putin and RPM in Argentina. But there are, of course, the other members of the G20, as you'd expect, and the other members of the G20, if they can act together, led by the EU perhaps, then that's probably the best Britain can do.
We shall see if Mr. Trump cancels the meeting he was going to have with Mr. Putin as well. Whether that would bother Mr. Putin is neither here nor there. Ambassador, just before we go, these are difficult times for your country, and you need friends and allies to help you. Are you confident the West is going to be a proper friend and ally in this crisis?
No, I mean, our experience in Crimea and in Donbass were actually Russians miscalculated because they thought at some moment that there would be the same with Ukraine as with Georgia. So everything will be finished by expressing concern and that's it. But in fact, again, as I mentioned, they miscalculated. We introduced sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, after their provocative actions in Donbass. And also we know that there would be another people included in the sanctions list after the fake elections on the east of Ukraine. So this train is going in the right direction. And that's why I believe that we can still have a potential to work together.
Ambassador, thank you for being with us this morning. Now, Pretty's also going to be leaving us in a minute. I think she's going over to the Commons. We're going to let her get back there for Prime Minister's questions. And in a moment, we're going to be joined by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss. But first, let's have a listen to Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. He was talking this morning about the Treasury's analysis, forecasts of the impact of Brexit if we were to leave on the May deal and on other alternatives. Here he is.
Well, if the only consideration was the economy, then the analysis shows clearly that remaining in the European Union would be a better outcome for the economy, but not by much. The Prime Minister's deal delivers an outcome that is very close to the economic benefits of remaining in, while having all the political benefits of being out. And clearly, people don't only look at the economy, they also look at the political and constitutional benefits of exiting the European Union. That was what drove the decision in the referendum vote.
So that was the Chancellor. Pretty, before we let you go, the Chancellor saying if we leave broadly on Mrs May deal, there will be a hit to the economy, but it won't be huge. It'll be about 1 to 2% of GDP. Comes to around 40 billion. It's about the output of Wales, I'm told. If we leave on anything like the terms you want, it could be 4 times that hit to the economy.
Well, we've been there before. We've heard many of these assumptions and forecasts in the run-up to the referendum. And no disrespect to friends and colleagues at the Treasury, but I don't think forecasting has been, in the right direction previously. And I have to say, I don't think it's the right thing really to be projecting based on a range of assumptions, wide ranges of figures that simply don't stack up. We have to really question, again, the assumptions behind these forecasts, the way the data has been collated. And I think, to say it again, the Treasury predicted all sorts of things in the run-up to the referendum, including unemployment rates of over 800,000 people being made unemployed, growth declining rapidly. And actually, we've seen over the last 2 years a very healthy and stable economy.
All right. We're going to let you go now, Pretty. Thank you for that. Stephen, I mean, in this very studio, when we covered the budget, we discovered that the Office for Budget Responsibility couldn't even tell us by a large margin what the deficit was going to be this year. Why should we listen to the Treasury telling us what the GDP is going to be in 2030?
Well, we get back a little bit to this "we've had enough of experts" argument, and I mean,
maybe just wrong experts.
Wrong. That is the other half of Gove's quote, was that we've had enough of experts who get things wrong all the time.
Okay, fair enough. I still believe in experts. I still believe that there are people who have a very clear understanding of what's going on in our economy. But I actually also agree, that this isn't only about the economy. It is also about how do we reunite our deeply divided country. And
so it's more than
view,
forecasts.
It's about a political compromise that gets the balance between sovereignty and prosperity right. We know that uncertainty and instability will always have a negative knock-on impact because business hates uncertainty, and we've got to protect the automotive sector, for example, which needs those just-in-time supply chains, and that has to be on the basis of a customs union and a single market.
And as if by magic, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Good morning,
Liz
Andrew.
Truss, good morning to you. Welcome back. I think it was only a week ago we had you.
It was. I just can't get enough.
Too much of a good thing. You can have here. So the Chancellor says if we leave on the May deal, it will hit the economy, but perhaps not by as much as other terms in which we were to leave. I can never remember being in a position where the government is saying our policy will make things worse than they are at the moment, but maybe not as bad as they could be if we did other things. That's unprecedented.
The Chancellor is clear that the economy will grow under all circumstances. What we're talking about here is specific modelling about trade. So clearly, the more trade we have, the better a trade deal we get with the EU and with other countries around the world, that will contribute more to GDP. But the key point here is this is all about differentials between different scenarios. It's an economic analysis. It is not a forecast. We deliberately have learnt the lessons of the past where, projecting things 15 years hence is a monk's game because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know which governments are going to be in power. We don't know what decisions will be taken about tax and spend. So this is about what will the impact on trade be on the economy? But there are a lot of unknowns.
I understand that. So when the Treasury says the GDP could be about 40 billion lower than it otherwise would be in 15 years' time. What bit of that's not a forecast am I not understanding?
Because we don't know what GDP will be in 15
So
years'
why
time.
bother
We
at all
don't
then?
know. Well, because Parliament asked us to provide the best possible analysis of the implications for trade. But trade is only one part of the economy. There are many other policies that affect the economy, whether it's planning policies, tax policies, what the United States president decides to do, all of those things. So I think we've got to be careful not to overstate how important this is relative to all of the other economic decisions that get made by governments.
So why bother, I would think?
Well, because Parliament asked them to. But also, I think it is the point the Chancellor made this morning, and Stephen has also made, that it's all very well talking about the economic impact of this, but ultimately it's bigger than that. And it's about making sure that the result of the referendum is reflected, but also that the country, which is incredibly divided, tries to move forward and try and deal with...
Which is more than economic forecast.
Which is much more than that.
Does the city take these... I mean, the city's own forecasts are quite regularly wrong. I mean, when I look at city consensus forecasts, they're usually not any better than the OBR or the Treasury. Does it take these forecasts seriously at all?
No. The idea that you can point to within 1% of future GDP that you don't know what it's even going to be, in 15 years down the line, you may as well try and predict the weather for a particular week 15 years down the line. City... if you look at the likes of the Bank of England, for example, and Andy Haldane, the chief economist, and he's done his sort of mea culpa on forecasting, and I think would agree with the Chief Secretary that it's a mug's game. And the other forecast that the city was most associated with, if you look at the likes of the former Chief Executive of the London Stock Exchange, she said by now about 250,000 jobs would have left the city as a result of the Leave vote. Current analysis suggests that the number of jobs that have actually been relocated, let alone just new jobs created elsewhere, is between about 750 and 5,000. And actually, there's some more data out tomorrow, which will show a pretty significant spike in the number of professional service roles created in the city in the last 12 months. So, all in all, whether it's jobs or growth, forecasts in the city are treated with the scepticism they deserve.
So, take that, forecasts. Now, as usual, during Prime Minister's Questions, which is coming up in about 5 minutes, our resident fact-checker will be on standby, except this week it's actually not our resident fact-checker. It's Jason, not Joe. You do have to have a name beginning with J, however, to be our fact-checker. Jason, he's going to be listening carefully for anything that doesn't quite stack up. So, Prime Minister's Questions with us very shortly. We're going to be joined by Laura Kuenssberg. Here she comes, striding into the studio.
Very high chair. We're having cocktails.
As if she's had nothing to do for the past... Oh, and now you're going down in the world.
No, I'm going down. We could amuse ourselves during PMQs with the chairs, if nothing else.
So, tell us, what's happened in the last 5 minutes?
Well, in the last 5 minutes, actually, I don't think anything's happened, so we can all breathe a sigh of relief. But in the
Pippa
last
told
half
me that
hour,
as well. She said that.
in the last half hour, we have, seen these forecasts emerging into the grey dawn. And it's a strange thing, isn't it? Because there's so many echoes of the referendum campaign.
Yes.
Even though, as Pippa rightly said, Parliament forced the government to do this. So people in government are a bit sort of, shall we say, itchy about being accused of putting these out to create Project Fear. That said, the Prime Minister's hope here is to scare MPs into voting for her deal, because there might be no Brexit or no deal, and therefore turmoil, chaos, to use her words. She said that yesterday. We were on the road with her in Northern Ireland. People don't want more uncertainty, they don't want more division, and that is the reason why she's calling on parliamentarians to vote for it, as well as what she's also trying to do is make the case for the agreement she's actually been able to broker.
And she's campaigning like an election on this at the moment.
She is campaigning like an election.
Barnstorming the country.
Absolutely, and it's a curious thing because it's like a general election where she's the only candidate, but the electorate are not the people she's shaking hands with at an agricultural fair in Wales. They're not the people who she talked to in Northern Ireland in a very soggy Belfast yesterday. The hope for Number 10 is to sort of try and, I think, create that inevitability, and so that when MPs go back to their constituencies this weekend, they hear from the public, and maybe Tory MPs in particular hear from their constituency chairman.
And that's why the Daily Mail poll was in sync with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a possibility here that you know, we're looking at a big disconnect between Parliament and where the public is. But the electorate for this deal is Parliament.
Is the Parliament.
It is not the public.
And Pippa was saying earlier that as the days go by, and I think sometimes you should discount the number of Tory MPs who say they're going to rebel.
Of course.
But even if you make a generous 50% deduction, the arithmetic is still daunting for the Prime Minister.
It looks, as we stand today, it looks almost impossible. But the vote isn't for another while. And look, things have changed so fast all the time in the last few years, if we've learned anything. You know, this time last week it was still, oh, look, there were about to be 48 letters to depose the Prime Minister, and by this time last Wednesday, actually, they all seem to have got a bit lost in the post. But it does seem...
As I've said before, that's what happens when you privatise the Royal Mail.
But it does seem that the
letters get lost in the post.
But, you know, if you take a general rule of thumb, as I have sceptically developed over the years, that any potential rebellion is probably going to be about half in the end.
Yes, exactly.
If there are
It's still a
nearly
lot.
100 Tory MPs now committing publicly to vote against it, 50, well, you know, divided by 2, you get by 50, and that's still a pretty thumping defeat. But where's the line that makes the idea of a second vote impossible?
I'd have thought 50 may be up there.
Well,
because I'm not
senior
sure
figure
any
said to me
tweets
this
that
morning
Brussels could make could swing 50. I think 10, 15 maybe. If you're on the wrong end of 50 votes, what do you do?
That's a hypothetical question. And
Most of the questions I ask are. It's a bit like your forecast.
Make a forecast. It's an analysis, not a forecast. The momentum is with the Prime Minister. You know, there is a lot of support for her tenacious approach amongst the public. When people do look at the deal and look at the alternatives on offer, which could be Brexit not happening at all, I think there is a significant opportunity to win more people over the next few weeks.
Let's go straight over to the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions.